Arc Raiders has one of the most quietly detailed sets of robotic enemies in any game right now, and today we are going through all of it, every unit type, every behavioural quirk, every scrap of lore that suggests what these machines actually are and what they want. Before I get into this, I want to be upfront about how this video was put together. I have been sitting with Arc Raiders lore for a while now, pulling from in-game text, environmental storytelling, item descriptions, and the way the robots themselves behave in the field. What you are going to hear is my interpretation of that material. I have not tried to present any of this as confirmed canon, because frankly, a lot of it is not confirmed. The game leaves enormous gaps on purpose. What I have tried to do instead is find the thread that connects the fragments and follow it as far as it goes. One choice I made deliberately was to lead with the machines themselves rather than the human factions, because I think the robots are the part of this world that most players still feel genuinely uncertain about, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes them interesting. So that is where we start. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The Day Something Fell from the Sky. The first confirmed reports of what would come to be called the Ark did not describe machines at all. They described light, long, blinding columns of light that punched through the cloud layer in the early hours before dawn, arriving without warning and without any detectable precursor signal that ground-based systems could interpret. The accounts that survived from those first hours are fragmentary, the kind of material you reconstruct from radio logs and handwritten notes found in structures that are mostly rubble now. But the pattern that emerges from those fragments is consistent. Whatever arrived that day did not come quietly, and it did not come small. The objects that generated those light columns were later designated as arc drop cylinders in the surviving scientific documentation, though by the time anyone was writing formal documentation, the world that would have peer-reviewed it no longer existed. The cylinders were enormous, larger than anything that had been launched from Earth, and they hit the surface with impacts that registered on seismic equipment hundreds of kilometers away. The craters they left behind are still there. Raiders who venture into the deep zones have described standing at the lip of those craters and looking down at the scarred earth, the soil fused into a kind of dark glass by the heat of entry, the surrounding vegetation flattened outward in a radial pattern. It is one of the more striking pieces of environmental storytelling in the game, and it points towards something about the scale of what arrived. What came out of those cylinders was not immediately understood. The first units to emerge were small, and witnesses who had survived the initial impact in sheltered positions described them as almost unremarkable at first glance. Low to the ground, deliberate in their movement, quiet in a way that struck observers as deeply wrong given everything that had just happened. The silence was apparently the detail that most people remembered. After the thunder of the impacts, after the shockwave and the screaming and the alarms, the machines that emerged from the cylinders simply moved, slowly and without any audible communication, fanning outward from the impact site in careful, measured arcs. The behaviour in those first minutes is something the lore returns to repeatedly, and I think it is worth pausing on. The machines did not immediately engage with human beings. They moved through the environment the way a surveyor might, pausing at intervals, turning in place, and then continuing. Some survivors described watching them from upper floors of buildings, holding their breath, certain the machines would turn and see them. Several accounts described that the machines did turn and looked directly at the hiding location, and then moved on without engaging. Whether that suggests the early units lacked targeting capability, or whether they were simply not in a combat phase yet, is one of the questions the lore leaves deliberately unanswered. What we do know is that the non-engagement phase did not last long. Within hours of the initial drops, Human military and emergency response assets were attempting to interact with the machines, and those interactions went badly from the start. The ARC units did not respond to radio contact, did not respond to light signals, did not respond to any of the standard protocols for communicating with an unknown entity. What they did respond to was proximity. Cross a certain threshold of closeness to an ARC unit without whatever signature the machines used to identify safe passage, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The law suggests that the transition from surveying to hostile response happened in less than a second. There was no warning behaviour, no escalation, simply distance and then not distance, and then an engagement. The military response in those first hours was documented extensively in the fragments of after-action reports that exist in the game's lore archive. Units were deployed, contact was made, and the reports stopped coming in. Not all at once and not always immediately, but the pattern is clear when you lay the timeline out. The machines were efficient in a way that human combatants were not prepared for, and the efficiency was not the flashy, explosive kind that makes for dramatic footage. It was methodical. ARC units coordinated without any communication that human signals intelligence could detect or interpret. They maneuvered in patterns that suggested awareness of each other's positions without any observable signaling between them. The after-action fragments describe the sensation of fighting an enemy that was thinking faster than the engagement allowed for, and doing so without any apparent effort. The first full day of the ARC's presence on Earth is reconstructed in the lore primarily through these scattered survivor accounts and document fragments, and putting them together gives you a picture of a world transitioning very quickly from confusion to catastrophe. Civilian populations in areas near the impact sites were displaced outward by the expanding perimeter of ARC activity. The machines were not initially pursuing those populations. They were doing something else. And that something else is the part of the lore that I find most compelling, because it suggests a coherent purpose behind the invasion that is more interesting than simple conquest. What the earliest units appeared to be doing in those first hours and days was cataloguing. The way they moved through environments suggested systematic coverage rather than random patrol. The way they interacted with certain objects and structures and not others suggested selective interest rather than indiscriminate destruction. Structures were analysed and then left standing. Soil samples appeared to be taken in some areas. Water sources were visited and then abandoned. The behaviour of a survey team conducted at machine speed over an area that had just been secured by force. The force was the means, not the end. The end was something else. This reading of the early ARC behaviour is, I want to be clear, one possible interpretation. The law does not explicitly confirm that the ARC was conducting a survey in those first days, but the pattern of behaviour that is described across multiple independent survivor accounts and document fragments points very strongly in that direction, and it aligns with what we can observe about ARC behaviour in the present day of the game. The machines are still doing something in the zones they control. They are still moving through those zones with purpose. Raiders go into those zones and observe that purpose without being able to fully understand it, and that gap between observation and understanding is one of the central tensions of the game. The scale of what arrived on that first day is worth sitting with for a moment. The ARC drop cylinders were not few in number. The lore suggests impacts across multiple continents, though the specific geography of the game's world is deliberately vague in ways that make direct real-world mapping difficult. What is clear is that this was not a probe or an advanced scout. The first day of the ARC's arrival was already a full deployment, a coordinated action conducted across a planetary surface simultaneously, suggesting a degree of planning and capability that dwarfs anything human civilization had encountered or imagined. The shock of that scale is something the human survivors in the lore carry with them constantly, and it comes through in the way they talk about the Ark. There is not much bravado in the accounts. There is mostly exhaustion and a kind of careful, cautious respect. The impact craters themselves became landmarks in the lore of the regions they fell in. Communities of survivors organized themselves around those craters, not to study them initially, but simply because the craters were fixed points in a landscape that had otherwise become extremely unpredictable. If you knew where a crater was, you knew where a high concentration of Ark units would be. And knowing where they were was the first step toward learning how to avoid them. The craters became reference points, then warnings, then eventually the subject of a great deal of dangerous research conducted by individuals brave or desperate enough to get close. The research that came out of those early crater studies forms a significant portion of what the lore tells us about the Ark as origin. Not confirmed origin, I want to be clear again, but strongly implied origin. The material composition of the cylinder fragments that could be recovered and analysed was not consistent with any known terrestrial manufacturing process. The alloys were structured in ways that suggested fabrication methods operating at scales and tolerances that human industry had not achieved. The electronic components, where they could be studied, were built on principles that were familiar enough to be interpreted but arranged in configurations that no human engineer had designed or conceived. All of this points towards something that arrived from somewhere else, which is the obvious conclusion, and one the game never tries to complicate with false mystery. The Ark is not human in origin. It is not a secret government project or a corporate experiment gone wrong, or any of the other explanations that human minds tend to reach for first when confronted with something incomprehensible. The lore is fairly direct about the extraterrestrial nature of the Ark, even if it deliberately withholds any information about where specifically the Ark came from or why it targeted this particular world. The absence of that information is intentional, and I think it is one of the smarter storytelling choices the game makes. The question of where the Ark came from is genuinely unanswerable within the context of the game's world, because no human being has been able to ask the Ark and receive an answer. The machines do not communicate, they do not negotiate, they do not explain themselves. They arrived, they deployed, they began their work, and the fact that their work has been catastrophic for human civilization does not appear to factor into their calculations in any way. They are not cruel, they are not angry, they are simply present and purposeful, and that purposefulness is completely opaque to human understanding. In the days and weeks following the initial drop, the pattern of Ark expansion began to clarify. The machines moved outward from their impact sites in a way that suggested zones of operation rather than random diffusion. Areas that the Ark units moved through and then departed from became different from areas they remained in. The zones they departed from were not safe exactly, but they were navigable. The zones they remained in became something else. The lore uses the term Ark Zone for these areas, and that term has a specific meaning in the game. An Ark Zone is not just an area with Ark units present, it is an area that the Ark has claimed and transformed, where the rules of engagement are different and the density of machines is high enough to make extended human presence essentially impossible. The transformation of Ark Zones is a topic I am going to spend considerable time on in later chapters, because it connects directly to what the machines are doing there, and what their long-term objectives appear to be. But for now, the important thing to understand about the early days of the Ark is that the transformation was not immediately visible. The Ark did not begin constructing massive structures or dramatically altering the landscape in the first days. The changes were subtle, the kind of subtle that is easy to miss when you're focused on surviving, which most people in those areas were. The slow realization that something fundamental was being altered, that the land itself was being worked on, came gradually, and by the time most people understood what they were seeing, they were already outside of it. The human military response to the Ark in those first weeks was not ineffective in the narrow sense of individual engagements. Arc units could be destroyed. This was established quickly, and it mattered enormously for morale in the early period. The machines were not invulnerable. They could be damaged by weapons that human forces already possessed. The problem was not that the Ark was individually unbeatable. The problem was that the Ark did not respond to losses the way a human military would. Units that were destroyed were not replaced by individuals that mourned their loss or reconsidered their strategy. The pattern of operation continued unchanged. Destroy a patrol, and the next patrol covered the same route at the same time. Remove a unit from an area, and the area was treated as if that unit had simply been reassigned. There was no flinching, no adaptation of the strategic picture in response to tactical setbacks. The Ark lost units the way a machine loses a component, and responded to that loss the way a machine responds to a component failure, by routing around it and continuing. This aspect of Ark behaviour is described in several survivor accounts with a kind of bleak clarity. One fragment of a military after-action report uses the phrase "continued as programmed" to describe the behaviour of Ark units following an engagement that inflicted significant losses. The choice of that phrase is interesting. Whether the officer who wrote it was making a specific technical observation or using a colloquial expression is something we cannot determine from the fragment. But the phrase stuck, and versions of it appear in other documents from different regions and different periods, suggesting that the observation was widespread and consistent. The Ark continued as programmed. Whatever the program was, it was not interrupted by individual casualties. The lore from the first month of the Ark's presence on Earth is dominated by this quality of relentless continuation. Human forces would find and exploit weaknesses. Ark units would be damaged or destroyed in engagement after engagement. Ground would be held briefly, and then the Ark would return, covering the same ground, following the same patterns, and the held ground would become contested ground and then lost ground. The mathematics of attrition were not on the human side. The Ark appeared to have resources that did not deplete in any visible way. Human forces had logistics chains that were already severely disrupted by the presence of the Ark in the first place. By the end of the first month, the map of human control and Ark control had shifted dramatically. This is not described in specific geographic terms in the lore, but the shape of the world the game takes place. It makes the overall picture clear. The Ark holds significant portions of what was once heavily populated and industrialized land. Humans survive in the spaces between, in areas the Ark has passed through but not retained, or in areas that the Ark has simply not reached yet. The Raiders, who are the player characters in the game, operate in that intermediate space, moving into Ark-controlled zones to recover resources and information, and then retreating before the machines can pin them down. The question of why human resistance did not collapse entirely in those first months is one the lore addresses in a way I find genuinely interesting. It was not superior human tactics, and it was not some discovered vulnerability in the Ark. The lore suggests fairly strongly that the Ark simply stopped advancing at a certain point. The expansion of Ark zones slowed, then paused. The machines continued to operate within the territories they had claimed, continued their inscrutable work, but the outward push stopped. Whether this represents a completed first phase of whatever the Ark is doing, or a resource limitation, or something else entirely, is not explained. But the pause in expansion is what created the space in which human survivors organized themselves and began the process of learning to coexist, however tentatively, with the new reality of their world. That coexistence is fragile and provisional, and the lore is careful not to romanticize it. The human communities that exist in the game's world are not thriving. They are enduring. They have food and shelter and some degree of security, but the constant awareness that the machines are present just beyond certain boundaries, that the rules of engagement in those zones are lethal and unforgiving, creates a kind of permanent low-grade pressure that shapes every aspect of life. The raiders who go into the zones are not heroes in the conventional sense. They are people willing to take on a risk that most people are not, for resources that the community needs, and the fact that some of them do not come back is accepted as part of the mathematics of survival. The mythology that has grown up around the Ark in those human communities is something the lore touches on in ways that are easy to miss if you're not looking for them. People have developed explanations for the Ark that are not technical or scientific, explanations that draw on older frameworks for understanding powerful and incomprehensible forces. Some communities speak of the Ark in terms that sound almost religious, not worshipping them, but treating them as phenomena that exist outside of the normal category of things that can be opposed or understood. Some speak of the Ark in terms that are more superstitious, attaching meaning to specific behaviors or unit types that the lore does not actually support, but that clearly provide a framework for making the incomprehensible manageable. The scientific and engineering communities that survived the initial period of the Ark's arrival have taken a very different approach, and their work forms another significant strand of the game's lore. These are the people trying to understand the machines technically, to reverse engineer their components, to map their behavioral patterns with enough precision to predict and potentially exploit them. The documents these communities produce are among the most interesting pieces of lore in the game, because they are simultaneously the most rigorous and the most limited. They can tell you exactly how a specific Ark component behaves under controlled conditions. They cannot tell you why that component does what it does in the larger context of the Ark's operation. The gap between technical understanding and contextual understanding is a theme that runs through a lot of the scientific lore around the Ark. The researchers can study the parts. They cannot study the whole, because the whole is present in force in zones they cannot safely access for extended periods. A raider can bring back a damaged component from a destroyed unit, and that component can be analysed in considerable detail. But understanding how that component functions in a living operating unit that is moving through its environment and coordinating with other units is a different order of problem, and it is one that the isolated fragments of recovered material cannot fully answer. The first chapter of the Ark's story in this world ends, somewhat arbitrarily, with the establishment of the current state of affairs. The Ark holds its zones, humans hold the margins, raiders move between them, and the machines continue their work, patient and purposeful, and entirely indifferent to the category of being called human. What that work is and what it means for the long-term future of the world is the question that the rest of the lore circles around without ever fully answering. The answer, if there is one, is somewhere in the zones, and the zones are dangerous. The transition from the initial invasion period to the current operational period of the Ark is described in the lore through a series of survivor testimonies that track the evolution of human understanding about the machines. In the early period, people talk about the Ark the way you talk about a natural disaster, something enormous and impersonal that has altered the landscape. In the later testimonies, you start to hear a different quality. People who have survived long enough and paid close enough attention begin to describe the Ark the way you describe a neighbour you have never spoken to. Still dangerous, still fundamentally other, but observed closely enough that certain patterns and regularities begin to feel almost familiar. That shift from disaster to neighbour is never comfortable, and the lore is not trying to make it comfortable. The familiarity is purely observational. Nobody is suggesting that the Ark is approachable or safe. But the people who survive longest in the world of Ark Raiders are the ones who have learned to read the machines, to understand their rhythms and their ranges and their trigger conditions. And that understanding requires spending a lot of time paying very close attention to things that will kill you if you get them wrong. The raiders who have been doing this longest are described in the lore as carrying a quality that is distinct from bravado or recklessness. It is more like the careful attention of someone who has learned to move through a space that belongs to something else without being noticed. What the machines were doing in those first weeks, what they are still doing now, is the central mystery the game is built around. Every other question follows from it. The unit types and their behaviours, the structure of the zones, the strange objects and installations that raiders find and bring back. All of it connects to that central question. Understanding the individual components of the Ark, the specific types of machines and what they do, is the work of the next several chapters. But it is worth keeping that central question in mind as we move through the details, because the details only become interesting when you hold them against that larger frame. The Ark arrived. It surveyed, it claimed, it continues. And somewhere in that continuation is an objective that no human being has yet been able to fully articulate or comprehend. That is where we are. That is the state of the world that Ark Raiders asks you to move through and survive. The first robots we will look at in detail are the ones Raiders encounter most often, the low-level units that form the outer layer of Ark presence in the zones. They are the most studied, the most documented, and in some ways the most mysterious because their abundance has not made them fully understood. Every raider who has spent time in the zones has a story about a close encounter with an Ark unit that should have ended badly, and did not, or one that ended badly without any apparent reason. The machines are consistent in their triggers, but not always predictable in their specific responses. And that gap between consistency and predictability is where most raider casualties occur. The law is honest about this. People die in the zones. Not always because they did something wrong, sometimes because the margin for error is simply very small, and the consequences of exceeding it are immediate and permanent. The documentation of Ark unit behaviour is one of the most active areas of research among surviving human communities, and the game reflects this through the density of law material around how specific unit types operate. Researchers and raiders both contribute to this documentation, from different angles and with different levels of rigour, and the combination of their perspectives gives a picture of the Ark that is richer than either could produce alone. The researchers can characterise what a unit does with precision. The raiders can tell you what that precision feels like on the ground, which is a different and equally important kind of knowledge. By this point in the narrative, you have a broad outline of what the Ark is and how it arrived, and what the general shape of the conflict looks like. The chapters that follow are going to zoom in on the specific components of that picture, the individual robot types, and what the lore tells us about each of them. We are going to start with the smallest and work our way up, both because that reflects the order in which raiders typically encounter them, and because there is a logic to the Ark's organisation that becomes clearer when you see it built up from its simplest elements. The smallest Ark units are the ones most often dismissed as minor threats, and that dismissal is a mistake that the lore documents repeatedly. Minor in terms of combat capability does not mean minor in terms of operational importance, and the small units play a role in the Ark's overall function that is disproportionate to their size. Understanding them is not just a survival consideration, it is a key to understanding the larger system they are part of. And the larger system is what this video is really about. So let us start small. Let us start with the units that are underfoot, the ones that a raider might step over without looking twice, and follow the thread from there upward through the Ark's hierarchy to the things that are genuinely frightening and the things that suggest something about the Ark's ultimate purpose. The story is in the details. The details are in the machines, and the machines are waiting in the zones. What follows is the product of a lot of time spent sitting with this lore, reading it carefully, and trying to understand it as a coherent system rather than a collection of separate facts. Some of what I am going to tell you is well supported by the available material, Some of it is inference and interpretation, and I will try to be clear about which is which. The goal is not to tell you the definitive truth about the Ark, because that definitive truth is not available. The goal is to give you the best possible account of what the evidence suggests, and to do that in a way that makes the Ark feel as strange and interesting as I think it genuinely is. Chapter 2. The Small Ones, Scout and Crawler Unit. Classes. The smallest Ark units in the game occupy a category that the lore refers to somewhat informally as Crawler class. The designation is not official in any surviving human institutional sense. It emerged from Raider slang and was eventually adopted by the research communities because it was accurate and already universally understood. Crawlers are the units that move low and fast, that appear in the periphery of a raider's field of vision and are easy to overlook until they are not. They are, by any reasonable measure, the most dangerous units in the Ark's operational inventory, precisely because they are the most easily dismissed. The physical description of crawler-class units that emerges from raider accounts and research documentation is fairly consistent. They are small, typically no larger than a dog, and often significantly smaller. They move on multiple limbs, the exact number varying between subtypes, in a gait that is described across multiple accounts as deeply unsettling to watch. Not because it is aggressive or threatening in itself, but because it is too smooth. The limbs are articulated in ways that do not match any biological model of movement. They flex and extend at angles that human observers consistently describe as wrong. Not violently wrong, but subtly wrong. The way an object looks when it is rotating in a direction you did not expect. The gait of the crawler units is one of the first things researchers noticed when they had the opportunity to observe the machines at any distance. The smoothness of movement is not a function of any obvious mechanical simplification. It would be easier, from an engineering standpoint, to produce a unit that moved with more obvious mechanical joints and a more recognizable step pattern. The crawler's movement is smooth because something in its design has prioritized that quality above simplicity. Whether that priority serves a specific operational function or represents an aesthetic choice by the Ark's designers, if there were designers in any meaningful sense, is one of the many questions the lore leaves open. What the crawler-class units do, functionally, is move through the environment ahead of larger units and generate information. The best current reading of their behavior suggests that they are sensor platforms, mobile data collection nodes that map the environment and relay what they find back through whatever network the Ark uses to coordinate its operations. This reading is supported by several pieces of evidence in the lore. The movement patterns of crawler units are consistent with coverage mapping. They do not patrol in the way that larger units patrol, moving back and forth along fixed routes. They move through areas in patterns that are more complex and more thorough, achieving maximum coverage of a given space in minimum time. The sensor capabilities of crawler units are difficult to assess from the outside, but the lore gives some strong hints. Raiders who have observed crawler units in operation consistently report that the units seem to detect things that should not be detectable by any optical or acoustic sensor system. They navigate in complete darkness without any visible light output. They respond to the presence of humans at distances and through obstacles that should block any line of sight detection system. They appear to detect the electromagnetic signature of human equipment, which has significant practical implications for raiders carrying electronics into the zones. The evidence for electromagnetic sensing is strong enough that several raider groups in the lore have adopted strict protocols around electronic equipment in areas with known crawler activity. The information that crawler units gather and presumably transmit is not something humans have been able to intercept or interpret. The Ark's communication system, if it can be called that, does not appear to operate on any frequency or in any format that human signals intelligence can detect. Researchers have spent considerable effort attempting to find evidence of the Ark's internal communication network, and have largely come up empty. The machines clearly coordinate. Their coordination is clearly real-time and precise. How that coordination is achieved is a complete mystery. The crawlers are presumably part of whatever system the Ark uses to maintain operational coherence, but the nature of their connection to that system is unknown. One of the most interesting behavioral observations about crawler units concerns what happens when one of them encounters something it cannot classify. The lore contains several accounts of crawlers stopping in front of objects, often objects that raiders had brought into the zone or altered in some way, and simply remaining motionless for extended periods. Not threatening behavior, not scanning behavior in any visible sense, just stillness. And then, after a period that witnesses describe as ranging from seconds to several minutes, the crawler would resume its movement and continue as if the pause had not occurred. What the crawler was doing during that pause and what conclusion it reached is entirely opaque, but the consistency of the behavior across multiple independent accounts suggests it is real and meaningful. The pause behavior is something researchers have tried to exploit, with limited success. The theory was that if a crawler was encountering something novel and spending time processing it, that processing time represented a window in which the crawler was not relaying information to the larger network and could potentially be approached or neutralized without triggering a broader response. In practice, this has not worked reliably. The pause does not appear to represent a communication gap. Ark response to threats in areas where crawlers had recently gone into pause mode was not slower or less coordinated than in areas with no pausing units. Whatever the pause means for the crawler's individual processing, it does not appear to interrupt its network connection. The interactions between crawler units and other Ark unit types are observable in the zones and have been documented by raiders who have spent extended periods watching Ark operations from concealment. What they describe is not what you would expect from a conventional military hierarchy. Larger units do not appear to give instructions to crawlers. Crawlers do not appear to report to larger units in any visible way. They simply operate in the same space, each following its own pattern, and the patterns do not conflict. Whether this represents a genuinely decentralized organization or a centralized one whose communication is simply invisible to human observers is not clear. But the apparent independence of individual Ark units, each operating according to its own logic, without visible coordination, is one of the things that makes the Ark so difficult to engage with strategically. When crawler units are destroyed, the reaction of nearby Ark units is one of the more studied phenomena in the game's lore. The immediate response of adjacent Ark units to a destroyed crawler is variable and context-dependent in ways that suggest situational awareness rather than programmed reaction. Sometimes the destruction of a crawler generates no visible response from nearby units at all. Sometimes it generates an immediate and aggressive sweep of the surrounding area. The difference between these responses does not appear to be explained by the method of destruction or the size of the engagement. It appears to be explained by something about the situation that human observers have not been able to fully characterize. The most compelling theory in the lore for this variability is that Ark units respond not to the fact of a crawler's destruction, but to the information context around that destruction. If the crawler's last transmission indicated an area was clear, and then the crawler stopped transmitting, the response might be different than if the crawler's last transmission indicated a potential threat was present. This theory treats the Ark as a network that responds to changes in information state, rather than to changes in physical state, and it has significant implications for how raiders should think about engaging Ark units. It suggests that what matters is not whether you destroy a unit, but what that unit had communicated before you destroyed it. Raider doctrine, such as it is in the game's lore, has developed several approaches to crawler units that reflect accumulated practical wisdom about their behavior. Most experienced raiders do not attempt to destroy crawlers unless there is a specific operational reason to do so. The risk of triggering a network response is considered too high relative to the tactical benefit of removing a single low-threat unit. Instead, experienced raiders work to avoid crawlers entirely, learning their movement patterns well enough to move through areas in the gaps between coverage sweeps. This is described in the lore as reading the space, a skill that takes time and attention to develop, and that separates raiders who have been operating in the zones for years from those who are new to it. Reading the space is a concept that comes up repeatedly in the game's lore, and it is worth spending some time on. It refers to a kind of situational awareness that is specific to Arc Zone operation, a learned ability to perceive the movement patterns of Arc units, without necessarily seeing them directly. Experienced raiders describe it as feeling the rhythm of a zone, understanding when and where the machines are moving, and finding the seams in that movement. It is not a supernatural ability, it is a skill built on pattern recognition and careful attention, but it sounds almost supernatural when people describe it from the outside, because it involves predicting the behavior of machines that do not communicate in any human-readable way. The crawler class has several identifiable subtypes in the game's lore. The most common variant is the basic mapping unit described above, the one that moves through areas in coverage patterns and presumably sends sensor data back to the network. A second variant is described in the lore as denser and slower, a unit that spends more time in individual locations before moving on, that appears to be collecting more detailed information about specific sites rather than broad area coverage. A third variant is faster and more directional in its movement, travelling in straight lines from point to point rather than covering areas, which suggests a courier or relay function rather than a primary sensing role. The existence of these subtypes is interesting because it suggests a division of labour within the crawler class that mirrors, at a very small scale, the larger organisational structure of the Arc as a whole. The Arc is not monolithic. Different units do different things. The differentiation of function across unit types implies design intent, a system that was built to perform a complex task by deploying specialised components rather than a single, general-purpose machine. The crawler subtypes are small, but they point toward the larger organisational logic. The courier variant of the crawler is particularly interesting to the research communities in the lore because it seems to move between different Arc installations in a way that might allow researchers to map the Arc's operational network if the couriers could be tracked without being detected. Several attempts at this have been documented in the lore, with mixed results. The couriers move quickly enough that tracking them through a zone is difficult, and any surveillance technology carried by a human observer risks detection by the courier's electromagnetic sensing. Remote observation from outside the zone is limited by the line-of-sight constraints of available equipment. The project of mapping Arc operational networks through courier tracking is described in the lore as ongoing and frustrating. What the courier variant appears to carry between Arc installations is not material. There are no external cargo attachments visible on recovered specimens, but the lore suggests it may be carrying information in a more literal sense. Not physically transporting a storage medium, but serving as a mobile network node that extends the Arc's communication range or relays between installations that cannot otherwise communicate directly. If this reading is correct, the courier crawlers are a critical infrastructure component of the Arc's operation, and their destruction might have more significant network consequences than the destruction of other unit types. Whether deliberately targeting couriers would disrupt Arc coordination is something the lore notes as an open question, and one that raiders have not yet been able to test systematically. The question of Arc consciousness is something that comes up in the lore around all unit types, but it is particularly interesting in the context of the crawlers because they are the units humans interact with most frequently, and observe most closely. The behavior of a crawler unit can be described technically as sensor coverage and network relay and occasional anomalous pause behavior. But there is a quality to that behavior, as described by the people who have spent time watching these machines, that resists purely technical description. The accounts describe something that feels like intention, not in the sense of malicious intent toward humans, but in the sense of purposeful attention to the environment. The machines seem to care, in some mechanical analogue of caring, about what they are sensing. Whether that apparent intentionality reflects genuine information processing that could be called cognition, or whether it is a behavioural artifact that reads as intentional without being so in any meaningful sense, is a question the law does not try to resolve. The researchers who study ARC units are careful to note that projecting cognitive states onto the machines is epistemically dangerous and operationally misleading. The raiders who work with those units in the field are less careful about this, and the language they use to describe ARC behaviour is full of cognitive attribution. The crawlers are watching. The crawlers are curious. The crawlers are waiting. These descriptions may be imprecise, but they capture something about the quality of the machine's behaviour that purely technical language tends to miss. The law of ARC unit behaviour at the crawler level establishes a baseline that all subsequent understanding of the ARC builds on. The crawlers are everywhere in the zones. They are the first thing a raider learns to deal with, and the last thing a raider stops worrying about. They are small and individually non-threatening and collectively essential to the ARC's operation. Understanding them is not sufficient for understanding the ARC, but it is necessary. Everything the ARC does in the zones, all the activity of the larger and more dangerous units, is built on the information platform that the crawlers provide. The small ones are the foundation, and the foundation is more interesting than it looks. Crawler units have been recovered in varying states of damage by raiders and researchers, and the examination of those recovered units has yielded some of the most detailed technical information available about ARC construction. The materials are consistently unusual, not impossibly exotic, not made of elements that do not appear on the periodic table, but processed and arranged in ways that demonstrate engineering capability that exceeds anything human manufacturing has produced. The tolerances are extraordinary. Components that should have failed under the stress of combat damage are held together by mechanical arrangements so precise that human researchers have struggled to understand how they were fabricated. The prevailing theory is that ARC units are manufactured by machines rather than by beings analogous to human workers, and that those manufacturing machines operate at tolerances that automated human manufacturing cannot match. The power systems of crawler units are another area of intense research interest. The units operate for extended periods, apparently without any need for external power supply or refueling. The power source within recovered crawler units is compact and dense in ways that suggest an energy storage or generation technology significantly beyond the current human state of the art. The energy density appears to be high enough to sustain extended operation without any of the weight or volume penalties that human battery technology imposes. Whether this represents a battery of some kind, a fuel cell, or something operating on an entirely different principle is not established. The researchers studying recovered arc power components describe them as consistent with known physical principles, but implementing those principles in ways that human engineering has not found. The durability of crawler units under field conditions is another well-documented aspect of ARC design. The units can operate in environments that would quickly disable human electronics. Temperature extremes, moisture, dust, electromagnetic interference, impact damage within certain limits, none of these appear to significantly degrade crawler unit performance. The units that are found in damaged states in the zones have typically been damaged by direct physical trauma beyond their design limits, not by environmental wear or equipment failure. This suggests that they were designed with robust environmental tolerances in mind, which in turn suggests that the environment they were designed to operate in was expected to be harsh. What that expected environment was, where the ark comes from, and what conditions prevail there, is impossible to determine from the units themselves. The design choices reflected in crawler unit construction could be consistent with a wide range of originating environments. All that can be said with confidence is that the ark's designers, or the processes that produce the ark, anticipated operating conditions that would stress ordinary equipment and built accordingly. The robustness of ark units is one of the factors that makes sustained human opposition to the ark so difficult. You can damage them. Destroying them reliably and repeatedly requires significant resources that human communities are struggling to maintain. The behavior of crawler units at the boundaries of ark zones is something raiders who operate along those boundaries have studied carefully. The zones have edges, and those edges are not arbitrary. The crawler units that operate along zone boundaries behave differently from those operating in zone interiors. They are more active at the boundaries, covering the edge of the zone's territory with a frequency and attention that suggests the boundaries matter to the ark's operation in some specific way. Whether the ark is monitoring for attempted incursions, or whether the boundaries represent something about the ark's internal organization, is not clear. But the boundary behavior of crawlers is one of the most reliable indicators of where a zone's edge actually is, which is useful information for raiders who need to navigate near zones without entering them. The question of whether crawler units are individually replaceable is something the law addresses indirectly through raider observations over time. When raiders return to areas they have operated in before, the crawler units they encounter are not the same physical units they saw previously. In most cases, units they have confirmed were destroyed are gone. But new units are present, operating in the same patterns. The implication is that the ark replaces destroyed units, that its operational density in a zone is maintained at some target level through the introduction of new units. Where those replacement units come from, whether they are manufactured on-site in the zone or transported from some other ark facility, is not established by the available law. But the replacement behavior suggests that the ark's capacity for production has not been meaningfully degraded by human opposition, which is a sobering conclusion. The pattern recognition skills that experienced raiders develop in relation to crawler units have been described in the law in ways that make them sound almost like a form of communication. Not communication in the sense of exchanging information with the machines, but in the sense of learning to read a language. The crawler's movement encodes information about the state of the zone, about what the ark has recently sensed, about where larger units are operating, about whether the zone has been disturbed recently. Raiders who learn to read this language can extract significant tactical information simply by watching crawlers move. The machines are not trying to be read, and they cannot be manipulated through this relationship. But the information is available to those patient and skilled enough to extract it. This quality of the crawlers, that they are simultaneously sensors and, inadvertently, broadcasters of information about the zone state, is one of the more interesting features of ark operational design. A fully opaque system would keep this information hidden. The fact that it can be read, however imperfectly, by skilled human observers suggests either a design oversight or a deliberate choice to allow some degree of observational transparency. Whether the ark would close this gap if it could, or whether the transparency serves some function that is not immediately obvious, is another of the questions that the law leaves deliberately open. The crawlers are the beginning of the story, but they are not a simple beginning. They are the most common and the most studied of ark units, and the study of them has generated as many questions as answers. What they do, broadly, is understood. How they do it is partly understood. Why the Ark designed this particular approach to area sensing and coverage, what the ultimate purpose of all that sensing is, remains as opaque as it was on the first day the machines emerged from their cylinders and began moving through a world that did not know what to make of them. We're going to move up the Ark hierarchy now, to the units that build on the foundation the crawlers provide. But carry the crawlers with you, as we do, because the patterns established at the smaller scale repeat themselves at larger scales, and the system starts to make a certain kind of sense when you see those patterns holding across unit types of very different sizes and apparent functions. The next category of Ark units is where the story gets more complicated and considerably more dangerous. Chapter 3. The Patrol Class, Enforcers of the Zone. The Patrol class of Ark units is what most raiders think of when they think about Ark machines. Not the first thing they encounter, not the most dangerous thing they face, but the most consistent presence in the zones, the units that define the rhythm of Ark-controlled territory and enforce the boundary between what the Ark permits and what it does not. Understanding the Patrol class is, in many ways, understanding daily life in the zones, and the lore around these units is correspondingly rich. The designation Patrol class is, like Crawler class, a human designation that has become standard through use rather than official adoption. The machines that fall into this category share certain behavioral characteristics, primarily the repetitive, route-based movement pattern that gives them their name. They move through defined areas, in patterns that repeat over time, covering the same ground at roughly regular intervals, maintaining a presence in areas that the Ark has deemed important enough to actively monitor. The definition of patrol, in other words, is behavioral rather than morphological. Patrol class units vary considerably in size and capability, but they all share the defining behavior of regular route-based area coverage. The route patterns of patrol class units have been studied extensively by raiders and researchers. The routes are not simple back and forth patterns. They are more complex, covering a three-dimensional space, including vertical movement in structures where this is possible, in a way that maximizes coverage while minimizing redundancy. A patrol unit covering a city block does not simply walk the perimeter. It moves through the block in a pattern that exposes every significant sightline over the course of a full patrol cycle. Understanding this pattern, including its timing, is what allows experienced raiders to move through patrol areas without contact. The window of opportunity between patrol sweeps is real, but it is narrow, and calculating it requires a level of attention to patrol timing that new raiders typically underestimate. The variability of patrol patterns over time is another area of significant interest. Patrol routes do not appear to be fixed permanently. There is evidence in the lore that patterns shift in response to changes in the zone environment, new structures, altered sightlines, areas of recent human activity. The adaptation of patrol patterns to environmental change suggests a level of route planning that is either automated and real-time or driven by some higher-level unit that oversees the patrol network. Either possibility is significant. Real-time automated route adaptation means the patrol class is smarter than simple programmed movement. Higher-level oversight means there is a command structure within the Ark that is not immediately visible in individual unit behavior. The detection capabilities of patrol class units are considerably more developed than those of crawlers. Where crawlers appear to be primarily sensor platforms, patrol units are both sensors and responders, capable of detecting threats and engaging them directly. The detection range and sensitivity of patrol units is one of the most practically important pieces of knowledge for raiders, and the lore reflects the considerable amount of attention that has been paid to characterizing it. Patrol units detect by multiple modalities: visual detection over significant distances in good conditions, acoustic detection of movement and impact, and the same electromagnetic sensing that crawlers appear to use. sensitive to the signatures of human equipment, and depending on the unit's subtype, potentially to the electromagnetic signature of living organisms. The question of whether patrol units can detect living organisms specifically, separate from their equipment, is one that the law handles carefully. There are accounts that suggest organic detection capability, raiders who have stripped their electronic equipment and still been detected in ways they could not explain by visual or acoustic factors. There are also accounts suggesting that this capability, if it exists, is inconsistent or limited, that the same technique works in some contexts and not others. The research documentation around this question is appropriately cautious, noting that the evidence for organic detection is suggestive but not conclusive, and that the variability of results could indicate capability limitations rather than capability absence. The engagement behavior of patrol class units when they detect a threat is one of the most studied topics in arc zone operation. The pattern is consistent enough to be characterized reliably. Detection is followed by a brief period of what observers describe as assessment, a short interval during which the unit pauses or slows and appears to process the detected stimulus before committing to a response. This assessment window is real, and experienced raiders have learned to use it. If you are detected and can move immediately to a position that eliminates the stimulus, whether by getting out of the detection range or by removing whatever triggered the detection, the assessment period can end without transitioning to active engagement. Whether the assessment period represents genuine decision-making by the patrol unit or a programmed delay built into the response sequence for technical reasons is not established, but the consistency of its duration across patrol unit subtypes and across different zones and different regions suggests it is a designed feature rather than an artifact. Something about ARC combat doctrine, if that word applies, includes a brief assessment step before commitment to engagement. This is either operationally rational, giving the unit time to gather better information before committing resources, or it reflects something about the ARC's underlying architecture that produces this behavior as a side effect. Once engagement is committed, the behavior of patrol class units becomes significantly less nuanced. The transition from assessment to attack is rapid, and the attack itself is sustained and coordinated with other nearby units in a way that suggests immediate network notification. Destroying a single patrol unit after it has transitioned to attack mode is not sufficient to end the engagement. Adjacent units are aware of the contact within a very short period and begin moving to converge. The speed of network notification appears to be near instantaneous. Raider doctrine treats the initiation of any engagement with patrol class units as the beginning of a larger engagement, not a contained one, unless specific conditions are met that prevent network notification from having operational effect. The weapons and combat capabilities of patrol class units are varied across subtypes, but consistently more than capable of dealing with unprepared human opponents. The basic patrol unit fields a directed energy weapon of some kind. The precise mechanism is not established in the law that fires in controlled bursts at a rate, and with a precision that reflects automated targeting rather than manual aim. The accuracy of arc weapons is noted in multiple combat accounts as one of the most significant advantages the machines hold over human combatants. They do not miss in the way that human shooters miss. Misses that occur appear to be the result of deliberate aim point adjustment rather than targeting error. The arc aims where it intends to aim. The durability of patrol class units under fire is significantly higher than that of crawlers. The armor systems of patrol units are designed to absorb and distribute impact energy in ways that make direct weapon impacts less immediately effective than raiders new to the zones expect. Combat veterans in the law consistently note that the experience of engaging patrol class units for the first time involves a recalibration of expectations about what it takes to disable or destroy them. Units that would appear to be critically damaged continue operating. Units that are visually intact suddenly stop functioning. The relationship between damage and operational status in ARC units is not straightforward and does not map well onto human equipment behavior. The recovery and self-repair capability of patrol class units is documented in the law as a significant tactical consideration. Units that are damaged but not destroyed will, given sufficient time and distance from ongoing threats, begin repairing themselves. The repair process is visible in the sense that damaged components can be seen being worked on by some internal mechanism, though the details of this process are not fully characterized. The practical implication for raiders is clear. A damaged ARC unit that withdraws from an engagement should not be assumed to remain in a degraded state indefinitely. Given time, it will recover. The law recommends decisive and rapid engagement if you're going to engage at all, because allowing a patrol unit time to self-repair is giving up a tactical advantage that may not recur. The patrol unit subtypes that the law characterizes in most detail include a medium-weight general patrol unit, a heavier variant with expanded weapon systems and increased armor, and a lighter, faster variant that appears optimized for pursuit rather than area coverage. Each of these subtypes has distinct behavioral characteristics that experienced raiders learn to identify at distance before engagement, as the tactical approach to each requires different preparation. Misidentifying a heavy variant for a standard unit has been fatal for raiders who base their engagement plan on incorrect unit assessment. The heavy patrol variant is worth specific attention because it introduces a capability that the standard variant lacks: the ability to call for significant reinforcement from outside the immediate patrol area. When a heavy variant initiates engagement, the network response is qualitatively different from that triggered by a standard unit. Not just adjacent units converging, but units from a broader area redirecting toward the contact point. Whether this represents a different privilege level in the ARC network or a stronger signal emission from the heavy unit is not clear. The practical effect is that engagements with heavy patrol variants escalate faster and to a larger scale, and the law treats them as engagements to be avoided rather than managed. The lighter pursuit variant has a different set of characteristics that make it dangerous in a different way. Its speed advantage over a running human is significant. Raiders who have been pursued by these units consistently describe the experience of hearing them closing behind as deeply alarming, because the rate of closure does not diminish with distance the way human pursuit does. The pursuit variant does not tire, it maintains its pace indefinitely. The only effective responses documented in the law are either to reach terrain that limits ARC unit mobility or to eliminate the unit before it closes to effective range. Outrunning it over open terrain is not generally possible for a human being. The patrol class taken as a whole represents the ARC's primary tool for maintaining control of its zones. The crawlers map and sense, the patrol units enforce. Everything in the zones that is not a crawler or a structure is accounted for by the patrol network, and that network is extensive enough and coordinated enough to make the zones deeply hostile to sustained human presence. The mathematics of patrol coverage, the frequency and thoroughness of sweeps, and the responsiveness of the network to detected threats is designed to make human activity in the zones reactive and brief rather than proactive and extended. Raiders who operate successfully in the zones do so by exploiting gaps in patrol coverage, not by opposing the patrol network directly. The question of how patrol routes are initially established when the ARC first occupies a new area is something the law touches on in interesting ways. Raider accounts from areas that were transitioning from non-ARC territory to ARC zone describe a period during which patrol behavior was less organized than it eventually became. Units moved through the area more randomly, coverage was less systematic, and the precision of patrol timing was lower. Over a period of days to weeks, the pattern crystallized into the regular, structured coverage that characterizes fully established arc zones. This crystallization process suggests that patrol route design is adaptive and learned rather than predetermined and fixed, that the arc adjusts its patrol architecture based on accumulated sensor data about the environment it is operating in. If patrol routes are learned through experience, then the information the crawlers gather during the initial survey of an area is the foundation on which patrol architecture is built. The crawlers map the space, the patrol units establish routes based on that map, and the routes are then refined over time as the patrol units generate their own operational data. This picture of a dynamic, self-organizing patrol network is considerably more sophisticated than the simple notion of programmed machines following preset routes, and it has significant implications for how raiders should think about operating in the zones. A patrol network that adapts to observed patterns of human activity is one that will, over time, close the gaps that raiders exploit. Staying unpredictable is not just good practice. It is, according to this reading of the law, operationally necessary. The adaptation question connects to a broader issue about arc learning capacity that the law raises without fully resolving. Can arc units learn in a meaningful sense? The evidence from patrol pattern adaptation suggests something like learning at the network level, a capacity to incorporate experience into operational decisions. Whether individual units also learn in some sense, whether a patrol unit that has engaged with a raider multiple times adjusts its behavior in response to that specific history, is less clear. The accounts of individual repeated encounters with ARC patrol units are ambiguous. Some raiders describe feeling that specific units recognized them or responded to them differently over time. Others describe no such effect. The evidence does not cleanly support either conclusion. The ARC patrol class is one of the most documented aspects of ARC operation because it is the one that raiders interact with most directly and most regularly. The documentation is rich with detail, but it is also full of the kind of uncertainty that characterizes knowledge built up through observation rather than controlled study. What raiders know about patrol units is accurate but incomplete. The law reflects this honestly, presenting the accumulated knowledge of experienced operators alongside the genuine uncertainty about what that knowledge means in the larger context of ARC behavior. This combination of detailed specific knowledge and deep structural uncertainty is one of the things that makes the ARC law compelling to work with. Moving through a patrol zone is an exercise in held breath and careful attention. You read the space, you find the seams, you move in the gaps between the machine's awareness and hope that you have read the pattern correctly. Most of the time, you have. Sometimes you have not, and then it is over very quickly, or you are running in a direction that you hope has an exit. The patrol class is not the most powerful thing in the ARC's inventory. It is not the thing that raider legends are made of in terms of single dramatic encounters. It is the thing that kills the most raiders over time, through the accumulation of small errors in the day-to-day work of operating in a space that does not belong to you. The ecology of the patrol class, the way different patrol unit subtypes interact with each other and with other ARC unit categories, is something we will return to in later chapters when we talk about zone structure and the larger organizational logic of ARC operations. For now, the important things to hold on to are the following. Patrol units are the primary active presence in ARC zones. They are smarter and more adaptive than their behavioral simplicity suggests. They operate as a network rather than as individuals, and engaging them directly is a choice that most experienced raiders avoid unless the operational benefit clearly outweighs the risk of network activation. The patrol class is the middle of the ARC's operational hierarchy. What is below them we have discussed. What is above them is where the law gets considerably more interesting. The units above the patrol class are less common and less studied, but they are the ones that suggest the most about what the Ark is actually trying to accomplish in the zones. The following chapters will take us into that territory. Patrol the Patrol class has built a clear picture of Ark zone operation at its routine level. The layers above that routine level are where the lore becomes more fragmentary and more interpretive, and consequently more fascinating. Every experienced raider has a patrol story. The one where the timing was off by 2 seconds and everything went wrong. The one where the route changed overnight and a space that was safe yesterday was lethal today. The one where the unit paused and looked directly at the hiding spot and then moved on, and the raider never understood why it did not engage. These stories are the texture of life in the zones. They are the practical lore, built not from recovered documents but from the accumulated experience of people moving through a space that does not want them there. And that practical lore, as much as the technical documentation, is what gives the Ark its character in this world. The patrol class is everywhere, and if you're spending time in an Ark zone, they are the thing you're most likely to be thinking about most of the time. Chapter 4: Harvester Units and the Work They Do. The Harvester class of Ark units is the one that most clearly answers the question of what the Ark is actually doing in the zones it controls. Not completely, not without significant remaining uncertainty, but more clearly than any other unit type. Harvesters are not combat units in the primary sense. They are workers. They are the machines that the combat and patrol infrastructure exists to protect. Understanding harvesters is understanding the Ark's economic logic, if that term can be applied to an entity whose objectives are as opaque as the Ark's. And understanding that economic logic is the closest we can get, with the available evidence, to understanding what the Ark ultimately wants. The physical profile of harvester units is significantly larger than crawler or standard patrol class units. They are built for cargo and manipulation rather than speed and engagement. Their limb configurations are different from combat units, oriented toward gripping, lifting, and processing rather than locomotion and weapon use. They move slowly relative to other Ark unit types, and their movement patterns are oriented around specific work sites rather than area coverage. A harvester unit is not patrolling, it is working. The distinction in behavior is visible from observation, where a patrol unit moves continuously through space. A harvester unit moves toward a site, operates there for a period, and then moves toward another site. Its movement is transactional. The work that harvester units do at their work sites is the central observable fact about them, and the central unanswered question. What is visible is that they extract material from the environment. They interact with soil, rock, structural materials, and certain types of technological equipment, removing or processing material and transferring it to collection systems that take it somewhere else in the zone. The removal is selective. Harvesters do not strip everything from a site. They take specific things and leave others. The specificity of what they take and what they leave is a major area of research interest, because understanding the selection criteria would provide significant information about what the Ark needs and why. The selection criteria that have been characterized from observation are complex and context-dependent in ways that resist simple characterization. Certain mineral types are consistently collected. Certain structural materials are consistently processed and removed. Certain electronic components from pre-Ark human equipment are consistently collected, while others are consistently ignored. The pattern is not purely about material composition, at least not in any simple elemental sense. There are cases where two items of similar composition are treated differently by harvesters, one collected and one ignored, in ways that suggest some property other than gross material composition is driving the selection. Researchers in the game's lore have proposed several theories for the selection criteria. One theory is that the Ark is optimizing for specific molecular structures rather than elemental compositions. that the selectivity reflects a need for particular chemical arrangements rather than particular raw materials. This would explain cases where materials of similar overall composition are treated differently. Another theory is that the selection is not purely material, that some energetic or structural property of the items is being assessed alongside their composition. A third theory, more speculative, is that the Ark is collecting according to a template that specifies what it needs for some manufacturing or construction process, and that the template is sufficiently complex that its logic is not immediately apparent from observing individual collection events. The destination of collected materials is one of the most significant unknowns in Ark Zone research. Harvesters transfer collected material to collection systems within the zone, and that material disappears into the Ark's infrastructure. Where it goes after that is not established. Researchers have attempted to trace collection pathways within zones, mapping the infrastructure that carries material from collection sites to whatever ultimate destination it reaches. But the pathways go deep into zone interiors that are not accessible for extended study. The best current reading of the available evidence is that material is transported to large, centralized Ark installations within the zone interior, but the nature and purpose of those installations is not fully characterized. The large Ark installations in zone interiors are described in the lore primarily through the accounts of raiders who have managed to observe them briefly from the edges of their perimeters, and through fragmentary aerial observation before Ark anti-air systems made that kind of observation impractical. What these accounts describe is substantial infrastructure, structures, and systems that are clearly constructed rather than natural, on a scale that implies significant engineering capability. The installations are not identical between zones. They vary in configuration and apparent complexity. Whether they serve the same function in each zone or different functions as part of a larger distributed system is not established. The relationship between harvesters and the larger installation infrastructure is described in the lore as symbiotic in a mechanical sense. The harvesters collect material and deliver it to the installations. The installations presumably process that material and produce something. What is produced is not directly observable from the available vantage points. The cycle of collection, delivery, and production repeats continuously, with a regularity and persistence that suggests it is not an incidental activity, but a central function of Ark Zone operation. The zones exist, at some level, to support this cycle. Harvester units are not combat units, but they are not defenseless. Their size and physical construction make them significantly more durable than patrol-class units, and they carry defensive systems that can engage threats at moderate range. More importantly, the destruction of a harvester unit triggers one of the strongest network responses of any Ark unit type. The response is not just adjacent units converging. It is a sustained organized search and neutralize operation that persists long after the immediate threat has been dealt with. The lore treats the Ark's response to harvester destruction as qualitatively different from its response to patrol unit losses, and the implications of this are significant. The intensity of the response to harvester casualties suggests that harvesters are valued by the Ark in some operational sense, that their destruction represents a more significant disruption than the destruction of combat units. If the Ark is primarily in the zones to conduct the collection and production cycle described above, then harvesters are central to its mission in a way that patrol units are not. Patrol units are infrastructure for protecting the mission. Harvesters are the mission, and the Ark's defensive response reflects this priority accordingly. Raider operations that target harvesters are described in the lore as high-risk, high-reward endeavors, distinct from the more routine work of navigating zone margins for salvage. Disrupting harvester operations, even temporarily, is considered a significant act of opposition to the Ark, and it triggers a response level that most raider teams are not equipped to handle for extended periods. The few documented cases in the lore of successful, sustained harvester interdiction involve substantial raider teams with significant firepower, rapid ingress and egress plans, and a great deal of luck. They are exceptional operations, not standard practice. The materials that harvesters collect are of interest to human communities, not just as research subjects, but as potential resources. Some of what harvesters collect is material that humans could use, and the prospect of intercepting ARC collection operations to redirect resources is one that has been attempted and is documented in the law. The practical challenge is that harvesters are guarded, and the collection sites they operate at are monitored by the patrol network. Getting close enough to a collection operation to intercept material without triggering a full response requires the kind of precise timing and operational skill that is beyond most raider teams. But the accounts of successful interceptions suggest it is possible. The behavior of harvesters when their collection operation is disrupted, but they themselves are not attacked, is interesting and somewhat counterintuitive. A harvester that is interrupted in a collection operation does not immediately engage the interrupting threat. It pauses, assesses in the same way that patrol units assess, and then makes a decision that is not always the same. Sometimes it resumes collection after the interruption passes. Sometimes it withdraws to a different collection site. Sometimes it calls for a patrol response without engaging directly. The variability of the response to disruption suggests that harvesters have a degree of operational discretion that simple threat response programming would not explain. The possibility that harvesters have higher cognitive capability than other ARC units is raised in the law in several places. Their tasks are more complex than patrol, requiring identification, evaluation, and selective collection of specific materials in variable environments. The kind of processing required to execute that task reliably in complex, cluttered environments is significant, and the question of whether it requires something analogous to decision-making is not trivial. Researchers who have studied harvester behavior note that its flexibility in response to disruption is consistent with a more sophisticated decision-making architecture than that of simpler unit types, though they are careful to note that flexibility in behavior does not by itself establish genuine cognitive capability. The relationship between harvesters and crawlers is visible in the field and is interesting. Crawlers appear to precede harvesters at collection sites, moving through the area before the harvester arrives in what looks like a site survey and clearance check. Harvesters arrive at sites that crawlers have recently visited. This relationship is suggestive of a workflow. Crawlers identify and assess sites, pass information to the network, and harvesters are dispatched to sites that the crawler data has flagged as collection-worthy. The implication is that the collection process is not random, that sites are pre-selected through the crawler network before harvester resources are deployed. The system is efficient in the way that a well-designed supply chain is efficient. The question of how far in advance sites are pre-selected and whether the ARC's collection plan covers a long-time horizon is one that the law raises without answering. The scale of ARC collection operations taken across all the zones is significant. The amount of material being processed and moved is enough that, if you could observe it comprehensively, you might be able to characterize the ARC's overall material requirements with some precision. Doing so from the fragmented observation available to human researchers has not been possible, but the attempt to aggregate individual collection observations into a picture of overall ARC material needs is described as an ongoing research project. What happens to the material after it is processed by the zone installations is genuinely unknown, and I want to be careful not to overstate the strength of the evidence around this question. There are theories. The most commonly discussed theory in the law is that processed material is somehow transported off-planet, back to wherever the ARC came from or to some other destination, as the ARC's primary output. This theory is consistent with the picture of the Ark as a harvesting operation rather than a conquest or colonization. If the Ark is here to collect and process specific materials and transport them elsewhere, then everything about its behavior in the zones makes sense as an extraction economy. The occupation of territory, the exclusion of humans, the careful and selective collection, the processing infrastructure, all of it fits the extraction economy model. The extraction economy model is the most compelling single-frame explanation for Ark behavior available in the law, and I think it is worth acknowledging directly. But it also has significant limitations as an explanation. It does not tell us why Earth, specifically, was targeted. It does not tell us what the collected and processed materials are used for at their destination. It does not tell us how long the extraction operation is expected to continue, or what happens when it is complete. These are not small omissions. They are the questions that determine what the long-term future of this world looks like. And the extraction economy model, compelling as it is, cannot answer them. The harvester units are the most direct evidence for the extraction economy model, and they are also the units whose behavior is most directly consequential for human survival in the regions affected by the Ark. The zones are not just dangerous because of combat units. They are dangerous because the underlying purpose of the zones is to support a harvesting operation that is indifferent to what it removes. The selective nature of Ark collection is cold comfort if what the Ark selects happens to include materials that human communities need. And the law suggests that the Ark's collection is extensive enough to have meaningfully depleted resources in the zones it has operated in over time. The ecological changes in Ark zones, the way resources have been depleted or transformed over the period of Ark occupation, are documented in raider accounts from different time periods and different zones. Early zone accounts describe environments that were disrupted but resource-rich, the aftermath of a civilization that had been abruptly interrupted. Later accounts describe increasingly depleted landscapes, where the materials that harvesters collect have been systematically removed, and the remaining environment is correspondingly impoverished. This trajectory, if it continues, ends in a zone that is fully depleted of whatever the Ark came for, at which point the question of what the Ark does next becomes urgent. Whether a fully depleted zone would be abandoned by the Ark, or whether the Ark would expand its operations into adjacent areas, or whether something else entirely would happen, is not answerable from the available evidence, but the trajectory is real, and the law reflects the awareness of human communities that the depletion they can observe in established zones represents a future condition toward which all Ark-adjacent areas are potentially heading. The harvesters are doing their work, and the work, if it continues long enough, will change everything. The harvester units are the reason the Ark is here, or the closest thing to an answer for that question that the law provides. They are the ones that make the invasion legible as a purposeful enterprise, rather than a catastrophe without direction. They are also the ones that make the invasion most clearly threatening in a long-term sense, not because they are dangerous to encounter individually, though they are, but because what they represent, an extraction operation on a planetary scale, conducted by a system that does not negotiate or respond to human interests, is a threat of a fundamentally different order than simple military occupation. The harvesters are working. They have been working since the first days of the Ark's arrival, and the scale of what they are working toward is something no human being has yet been able to fully comprehend. Chapter 5. The Sentinel Class, guardians of what matters above the patrol class and operating in a different register entirely. The Sentinel class of Ark units represents the first unit category that can genuinely be called dangerous in the way that raiders mean when they use that word with emphasis. Every unit in the Ark's inventory is dangerous. Sentinels are the ones where danger means something qualitatively different, where the gap between a capable raider and a fatal outcome is narrow enough that experience and skill stop being reliable guarantors of survival. Sentinels occupy specific positions in arc zones that the lore consistently describes as important, and the intensity of their capability matches the importance of what they guard. The Sentinel class is distinguished from the Patrol class by its behavioral mode. Where Patrol units move, Sentinel units are largely static. They are positioned at specific sites and they stay there. Their job is not coverage, it is control of a specific point. The sites they occupy are not random. They are always sites that the lore's accumulated evidence identifies as significant within the Ark's operational structure, collection infrastructure, communication nodes, zone boundary crossings, and the approaches to the large interior installations that harvesters deliver material to. Sentinels mark what matters. Understanding what Sentinels guard is a shortcut to understanding what the Ark values. The physical description of Sentinel units varies considerably across subtypes, but the defining characteristic of the Sentinel class is scale. These are the largest units that raiders encounter in routine zone operations, significantly larger than Patrol class units, and built with a different kind of presence. Where Patrol units are designed to move efficiently through space, Sentinels are designed to dominate space, to occupy a position in a way that fills it and makes approach both physically difficult and psychologically affecting. Raider accounts consistently describe the experience of approaching a Sentinel position as having a particular quality that other Ark encounters do not, a combination of the unit's physical size and the implicit knowledge of what it means to be in its detection range. The detection capability of Sentinel-class units exceeds that of any other Ark category in the standard zone hierarchy. Their sensor range is significantly greater than that of Patrol units. Their sensor modalities appear to be more numerous, and their processing of sensor information appears to be faster. The practical consequence is that the approach to a Sentinel position requires significantly more planning and skill than approach to patrol areas. The margins that experienced raiders work within when navigating patrol networks are not sufficient for Sentinel positions. The margins need to be wider, the preparation more careful, and the plan for, if the approach goes wrong, more thought through. The weapon systems of Sentinel units are the most capable of any standard zone unit, and the lore documents them with a level of detail that reflects how important it is for raiders to understand what they're dealing with before they are in range of it. The primary weapons are directed energy systems of greater power and range than those carried by patrol units. Some Sentinel subtypes carry additional systems capable of area suppression rather than point targeting, which means that the standard raider tactic of rapid movement to cover is not as effective against Sentinels as against patrol units. Suppression capability implies that the Sentinel can prevent movement across a defined area, not just target a specific individual, and this fundamentally changes the engagement calculus. The durability of Sentinel units under fire is, as you would expect, correspondingly higher than that of other unit types. The armor systems are heavier and more sophisticated. The self-repair capability appears to be more robust, and the threshold of damage required to meaningfully degrade a Sentinel's performance is high enough that engagements intended to force a Sentinel to withdraw, rather than destroy it, require sustained and coordinated fire that most raider teams cannot sustain without taking significant casualties themselves. The Sentinel is designed to hold its position under attack, not just to threaten attackers. It is a defensive asset in every sense. The network integration of Sentinel units appears to operate at a higher priority level than that of patrol units, meaning that a Sentinel in distress generates a faster and larger network response than a patrol unit in distress. This makes any engagement with a Sentinel an operation that will quickly involve significant additional Ark forces. The network response to a sentinel engagement is described in the law as one of the most intense hostile situations a raider team can find themselves in, and successful sentinel engagements that did not result in the raider team being overrun are rare enough to be notable. The question of whether sentinels can be bypassed, moved past without engagement rather than engaged and destroyed, is one that the law addresses with more complexity than the question might seem to warrant. In theory, a sufficiently skilled raider operating at the absolute limit of detection avoidance might be able to move past a sentinel without triggering detection. In practice, the detection range and sensor sophistication of sentinel units makes this extremely difficult, and the margin for error extremely small. Raider accounts of successful sentinel bypasses exist in the law, and they are consistently described as some of the most intense operational experiences the individuals involved had ever had. Not because combat happened, but because it almost did, and the gap between almost and actually was measured in centimeters of movement and fractions of a second of timing. The sites that sentinels occupy and what those sites reveal about ARC priorities is, as mentioned above, one of the most useful analytical tools available in the law. The concentration of sentinel units around certain types of infrastructure tells you that infrastructure is important. The absence of sentinels from other types of infrastructure tells you that infrastructure is not a priority for the ARC to protect at the sentinel level. Mapping sentinel positions relative to zone infrastructure is a way of reading the ARC's operational priorities without needing to understand the ARC's internal logic directly. The map of what sentinels guard is a map of what the ARC cannot afford to have disrupted. What that map shows, based on the accounts and documentation in the law, is that the ARC's highest protection assets are its production and processing infrastructure. Specifically, the large installations in zone interiors, the collection delivery systems that connect harvester operations to those installations, and certain communication or coordination nodes that appear to maintain the network coherence of zone operations. Combat and patrol infrastructure is not heavily protected by sentinels. The production side of the ARC's operation is. This strongly supports the extraction economy model of ARC purpose and suggests that the ARC's primary concern is not military security, but operational continuity of the extraction and processing function. The Sentinel class also includes a subtype that is described in the law as mobile, operating in a range from a fixed point rather than maintaining absolute position. This mobile Sentinel variant covers a larger area than a static Sentinel, but with lower sensor density within that area, representing a different trade-off between coverage and intensity. The mobile Sentinel subtype is typically found in transition zones between the heavily guarded interior and the patrol-covered margins, serving as a bridge between the two layers of security. Encountering a mobile Sentinel variant when you thought you were in patrol territory is described as one of the more unpleasant surprises the zones offer. The behavioral interaction between Sentinel units and harvesters is something that raiders who have observed both operating in close proximity describe with interest. Sentinels are aware of harvesters and appear to factor them into their security assessment. An approaching threat that would trigger immediate Sentinel engagement is not engaged if a harvester is in the line of fire, a calculus that implies the Sentinel is operating with an awareness of which ARC assets take priority and a willingness to delay engagement to avoid friendly interaction. Whether this represents sophisticated tactical decision-making or a simple collision avoidance protocol built into the ARC's network coordination is unclear, but the behavior suggests a level of contextual awareness beyond simple threat response. The psychological impact of Sentinel units on human populations near ARC zones is documented in the law in ways that go beyond simple threat assessment. Sentinels are visible in a way that most other ARC units are not. They occupy fixed positions at altitude where possible or at dominant terrain features, and their scale makes them visible at distances where their specific capabilities cannot be assessed. The presence of a sentinel at a distance is a constant reminder of Ark control and capability, and the lore suggests that this visibility may not be incidental. The Ark, which has demonstrated consistently that it designs for function rather than display, has nevertheless positioned its most capable units in positions where they are maximally visible to the surrounding environment. Whether this serves a functional deterrence purpose or is a design artifact is another open question. The response of sentinels to observed human activity at distance is one of the most studied aspects of their behavior. Sentinels do not engage automatically at maximum detection range. There appears to be a distance threshold below maximum detection range at which engagement transitions from potential to immediate. Within this threshold, the sentinel's behavior suggests active threat assessment rather than automatic engagement. Observers who have been within maximum detection range of sentinels and remained unengaged describe the experience as deeply uncomfortable, not because engagement is certain, but because its absence is unexplained. Something about their presence was assessed and found non-threatening, or the sentinel made a decision not to engage for reasons that are not apparent from the outside. The idea that sentinels make engagement decisions based on something other than simple presence within detection range is supported by several accounts in the lore and represents one of the more interesting aspects of sentinel behavior. The decision not to engage is as interesting as the decision to engage because it implies that the sentinel is making a distinction between types of detected presence. What criteria inform that distinction are not fully characterized, but the accounts suggest that stillness, slow movement, and the absence of active electronic signatures are factors that shift the probability of engagement downward. Whether this reflects a design choice by the Ark to avoid wasting defensive resources on non-threats or a more sophisticated threat assessment capability is not established. Sentinel units that have been destroyed, where this has been accomplished, yield recovered components that are among the most valuable research materials in the game's lore. The sensor systems in particular are of intense interest, because understanding how the Ark builds a sensor capable of the range and sensitivity that Sentinels demonstrate would be enormously valuable for human defensive and offensive capability development. The power systems in Sentinel units are also of significant interest because the energy demands of running the sensor and weapon systems they carry imply a power source well beyond what recovered crawler or patrol unit components have shown. The research work on recovered Sentinel components is described in the lore as slow and technically demanding. The components are more complex than those in lower unit classes, both in design and in the apparent level of fabrication sophistication. Some components have been found to be actively resistant to disassembly, not through physical hardness, but through designs that lose critical properties when the assemblies they are part of are disturbed. This designed fragility of certain subcomponents suggests that the Ark builds some of its most critical technology to be non-recoverable, not invulnerable to destruction, but degraded by the kind of disassembly that would allow reverse engineering. Whether this is a deliberate anti-intelligence measure or a side effect of design choices made for other reasons is another open question. The concept of the Sentinel as a threshold marker is worth sitting with. The Sentinel class marks the transition from the outer, navigable portion of an Ark zone to the inner, operationally critical portion. Everything outward from Sentinel positions is dangerous but potentially navigable for skilled raiders. Everything inward from Sentinel positions is territory that the Ark actively refuses human access to. The few accounts in the lore of what lies beyond Sentinel lines describe an environment that is qualitatively different from the zone margins, more dense with Ark infrastructure, more active with harvester operations, and more thoroughly covered by detection and response systems. It is the inner zone, and it is where the Ark's real work happens. What the Ark is doing in those inner zones, and what the Sentinels are protecting connects directly to the questions that the entire law architecture is built around. The extraction economy, the processing of collected materials, the production of something whose nature and destination is unknown. The Sentinels stand between the human world and the answer to those questions, and they are very, very good at their job. The raiders who have gotten closest to those answers are the ones who have found ways past the Sentinels, and their accounts of what they saw, however brief, are among the most important pieces of lore in the game. The Sentinel class is not the top of the Ark's military hierarchy. Above the Sentinels there are units that the lore treats differently, not just as more powerful versions of lower classes, but as qualitatively distinct entities that operate in a different register entirely. The Sentinels are the top of the zone security infrastructure, as raiders normally encounter it. What lies above them, in those rare and catastrophic encounters that the lore documents as the most extreme experiences in Ark Zone operation, is a different chapter entirely. But the Sentinels are the wall. They are the thing you have to get past to get to the truth of what the Ark is doing, and they were built very deliberately to be a wall that is almost impossible to breach without consequences. Chapter 6: Communication, Coordination, and the Ark Network. One of the most persistently mysterious aspects of the Ark is the question of how its units communicate with each other. From the first days of the Ark's arrival, when human signals intelligence failed to detect any transmission that could be attributed to Ark unit coordination, to the present state of Ark Zone operation, where units coordinate with a precision that implies constant and comprehensive information sharing, the mechanism of Ark communication has been a central puzzle. Understanding it would potentially unlock the ability to intercept, interfere with, or exploit Ark coordination. Not understanding it is one of the primary reasons that direct military opposition to the Ark has consistently underperformed expectations. The absence of detectable electromagnetic communication from Ark units is the starting point for any discussion of Ark network architecture. Human signals intelligence is extensive and covers a wide range of frequencies and modalities. The failure to detect Ark transmissions is not for lack of looking. Researchers and military personnel have monitored the electromagnetic spectrum with high sensitivity in and around Ark zones for the full period of Ark occupation without finding signals that can be confidently attributed to Ark unit communication. The machines are clearly coordinating, and they're clearly not doing it through any electromagnetic channel that human detection systems can characterize. Several theories have been proposed for what the Ark is using instead. One theory, supported by some indirect evidence, is that Ark units communicate through a modality that is not electromagnetic at all, possibly using quantum entanglement or some other physical phenomenon that does not propagate through conventional signal channels. This theory is popular in the research community because it explains the detection failure cleanly, but it requires Ark technology to be operating on physical principles that human science has not yet made practically applicable. The theory is not impossible, but it posits a level of technological sophistication that is difficult to assess from outside. A second theory is that Ark communication does use electromagnetic channels, but in a range or format that human detection systems are not configured to detect. The electromagnetic spectrum is enormous, and monitoring systems are necessarily selective in what they cover. It is conceivable that Ark communication occupies a frequency range, or uses a modulation scheme that happens to fall in a gap in human monitoring capability. This theory is less intellectually dramatic than quantum entanglement, and has the advantage of not requiring Ark technology to transcend established physics. But it also implies that solving the detection problem is just a matter of expanding the monitoring range, which has been attempted without success. A third theory, and in some ways the most compelling, is that Ark units do not communicate through a separate channel at all, but are connected through a distributed network architecture. in which each unit is both a node and a relay, passing information through a web of direct unit-to-unit connections, rather than through any centralized broadcast. This theory would explain the coordination without requiring any transmission that travels beyond the immediate vicinity of arc units. It would also explain the robustness of arc coordination, the fact that removing individual units from the field does not appear to degrade the network. If every unit is connected to several adjacent units rather than to a central hub, losing individual nodes degrades the network gradually rather than catastrophically. The distributed network theory also suggests interesting things about the role of crawler units in the ARC's communication architecture. If communication passes unit to unit through the network, then dense unit coverage, which crawlers provide, is not just a sensing function, but a communication infrastructure function. The crawlers are not just mapping the environment, they are the wires the network runs on. This double function would explain the priority the ARC places on maintaining crawler coverage in its zones and the sensitivity of the network response to disruption of crawler operations. Disrupt the crawlers, and you are not just removing sensors, you are cutting network links. The practical implications of the communication theories for radar operations are significant but different depending on which theory is correct. If ARC communication is quantum entangled, there is no practical way to interfere with it with current human technology. If it occupies an undetected electromagnetic range, finding that range opens up interference possibilities. If it is distributed through physical proximity, then creating gaps in ARC unit coverage through strategic elimination of units in a specific area might create communication dead zones that could be exploited operationally. Each theory points toward a different strategy, and the inability to confirm which theory is correct means that strategic exploitation of communication vulnerabilities remains theoretical. The law contains several accounts of what appear to be ARC network disruptions, incidents in which ARC unit coordination seem degraded or compromised in specific areas for brief periods. These accounts are inconsistent and hard to evaluate because distinguishing genuine network disruption from coincidental variation in unit behavior is difficult without controlled conditions. But a few accounts are detailed enough and specific enough to be interesting. One describes a pattern of patrol unit behavior in a specific zone that was noticeably different from the established pattern for a period of roughly 2 days, with units following routes that overlapped and created gaps rather than complementing each other. After the 2-day period, the behavior returned to its previous pattern. What caused the anomaly, whether it was a network disruption or something else, is not established. The idea that the ARC network can experience something like disruption, even temporarily, is significant if accurate. It implies that the network is not perfectly redundant, that there are conditions under which its coordination can be impaired. Finding and exploiting those conditions would be operationally significant. The research community's approach to this question is to aggregate all available accounts of anomalous ARC coordination behavior and look for common factors that might indicate what triggers disruption. This project is described in the law as ongoing and not yet yielding actionable conclusions. The response of ARC units to the deaths of their peers, considered through the lens of network communication, reveals something interesting. As noted in earlier chapters, the ARC does not respond to unit losses the way a conventional military would. There is no visible grief, no disruption of operations, no strategic recalibration visible at the unit level. But the network response to unit loss is not zero. The surviving units in the area behave differently after a loss event, even if the overall pattern of operations continues. The difference is subtle but consistent. Something changes in the network state when a unit is destroyed, and that change propagates outward in some way. Whether this represents the network updating its state to reflect a changed operational condition, or something more interesting about how the ARC processes unit loss is not clear. The centralization question in ARC network architecture is one that the law approaches carefully. Is there a central node in the ARC network, something that coordinates the overall operation of a zone or of all zones, and that would represent a single point of failure? The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. On one hand, the consistency of ARC behavior across zones, the fact that similar operational patterns appear in zones that are geographically distant from each other, suggests some form of common coordination that goes beyond individual zone level. On the other hand, the robustness of ARC response to local disruptions, the lack of any visible degradation in overall ARC capability in response to specific tactical setbacks, suggests that the network is highly redundant. A network that is both highly consistent across geographic scales and highly robust to local disruption could have any number of architectures. It could be fully decentralized with very strong protocols producing emergent consistency. It could be centralized at a level that is physically remote from all the zones, perhaps not on Earth at all. It could be a hybrid, with local coordination handled by distributed node architecture and global coordination handled by some form of centralized signal. The law does not resolve between these possibilities, and the existing evidence is consistent with all of them. The most significant unknown in ARC network architecture is whether the network has a consciousness. Not individual unit consciousness, which we will discuss in a later chapter, but network-level consciousness. The idea that the ARC taken as a whole constitutes a kind of distributed mind that coordinates its operation through something analogous to thought rather than through programmed protocols is a theory that appears in the law in several places, always framed as speculation rather than fact, but always framed carefully and with respect for the evidence that supports it. The behavior of the ARC network, its adaptive responses, its strategic consistency, its apparent ability to prioritize across competing operational demands, is consistent with something like distributed cognition. Whether it actually is, that is a different question. The human observers who spend the most time in and around ARC zones tend to develop opinions about ARC intelligence that are more nuanced than either the dismissive nothing but machines view or the credulous it's a single consciousness view. The experienced raiders and researchers who have spent years studying ARC behavior tend to describe it in terms that suggest something in between, a system that is more than simple programming, but less than the kind of consciousness that would be recognizable as such from a human perspective, a kind of limited intelligence that is sufficient for the tasks the ARC performs, optimized for those tasks, and possibly incapable of operating outside of them. Not a mind in the full human sense, but not pure mechanism either. The communication question is ultimately connected to the consciousness question, because the nature of communication in a system that has consciousness is different from the nature of communication in a system that does not. If ARC units are nodes in a network without consciousness, their communication is data exchange, operational state updates, threat reports, coordination instructions. If ARC units are something more than that, the communication might be something more than that too. The distinction matters for the question of what disrupting the communication would mean. Disrupting a data network is a technical operation. Disrupting something that functions like a nervous system of a conscious entity is something different. The ARC's network is the thing that makes the ARC what it is. Individual units, considered in isolation, are sophisticated machines with impressive capabilities. What makes the ARC more than the sum of its parts is the network that connects them, that makes them coordinate without visible communication, that allows a response to a threat in one part of a zone to generate behavior changes in units elsewhere in the zone. The network is the intelligence of the system, at whatever level that intelligence operates, and the network is the thing that human opposition to the ARC has not yet found a way to directly engage. The research and operational literature in the ARC law is extensive on the topic of network engagement as a strategic possibility. The conclusion that consistently emerges is that direct engagement of the ARC network is not currently possible with available human capability. The network cannot be detected, cannot be interfered with reliably, and cannot be attacked at any identified node. What can be done is to operate within the zones in ways that minimize the information available to the network, to stay below the threshold of detection and network notification as long as possible, and to shape operational timelines around the rhythm of the network's awareness, rather than trying to operate against it. Raiders are not fighting the network. They are trying not to be noticed by it. That humble and pragmatic relationship with the ARC network, the acceptance that you cannot fight it directly, but can navigate it carefully, is one of the defining characteristics of successful raider operation, as described in the law. It shapes everything about how raiders approach the zones. It is also, potentially, the key to understanding what the ARC's limitations are. A system that relies on its network for coordination is vulnerable to conditions that impair that network. Finding those conditions is the most promising avenue for meaningful opposition to the ARC that the law identifies. The network continues to operate. The coordination continues. The zones continue to function as integrated operational units because the network that connects their components is intact. And until something changes that condition, the zones will remain what they are. The ARC's territory, maintained by an invisible web of coordination that human technology cannot yet touch. Chapter 7. Large class units and the interior of the ARC zones. The large class ARC units are the ones that appear in raider accounts. The way that wolves appear in folk stories, as the thing at the center of the dangerous place that you know about before you ever go there, and that defines the nature of the risk you're taking. They are not encountered routinely. They operate in the interior zones, behind the patrol and sentinel layers that most raiders never get past. When they do appear in the zone margins, typically in response to a significant threat or disturbance, their presence transforms the character of the engagement in a way that is immediately apparent to everyone involved. The large class designation covers several distinct unit types that share the common characteristic of scale, both physical scale and operational scale. They are built for operations that smaller units cannot perform, handling logistics enforcement and capability at a level that reflects the ARC's investment in the integrity of its inner zones. Understanding them is not primarily about knowing how to fight them, because fighting them is an undertaking that most raider teams cannot sustain and survive. Understanding them is about knowing what they protect, what they are doing when they are not being fought, and what their presence in a given area means about the ARC's priorities in that area. The largest commonly documented large class unit type is what raider terminology has settled on calling a constructor. The name is descriptive rather than confirmed, derived from observations of these units appearing to build or modify structures within ARC zones. Constructors are significantly larger than sentinels, moving on multiple heavy limbs with a deliberate slowness that belies their weight and capability. They carry manipulation systems capable of moving and assembling large-scale structural components, and they are observed in the law primarily in the context of ARC installation work, assembling or modifying the permanent infrastructure of the zones. The constructor's role in the extraction economy model is clear. They build and maintain the infrastructure that supports harvester operations and materials processing. They are the builders of the ARC's physical presence in the zones. Without them, the installations that harvesters deliver to would not exist or could not be expanded or maintained. Their presence in the zone interior and their relative rarity in zone margins is consistent with a function that is entirely oriented toward internal construction and maintenance rather than external security or operations. The defensive capability of constructor units is significant despite their primary role being constructive. They carry defensive systems capable of engaging multiple simultaneous threats at range, and their physical durability exceeds that of sentinels. An encounter with a constructor that has transitioned to defensive mode is described in the lore as one of the most severe situations available in zone operation. The combination of their size, durability, and weapon range means that breaking contact from a constructor engagement, even when the decision to break contact comes immediately, is not guaranteed to succeed. The second major large class unit type is the one that appears most dramatically in Raider lore, the unit that features in the most extreme accounts, and that has the most developed mythology around it in human communities near the zones. It does not have a stable human name, which is itself significant. Different Raider communities have called it different things. Some accounts call it an apex unit. Some call it an overseer. The lack of standardized terminology reflects the rarity of encounters and the varying conditions under which those encounters have occurred, making comparison and standardization difficult. What the accounts describe consistently across the variety of names and contexts is a unit that is different from all other ARC units, not just in scale but in behavior. Where other units operate within patterns, following routes, covering areas, guarding positions, this unit moves with what witnesses describe as deliberation. It appears to be assessing rather than executing a predefined task. It moves through areas in ways that do not match the coverage or patrol patterns of other unit types. It interacts with other ARC units in ways that suggest command authority rather than peer coordination. Units changing their behavior in its presence in ways that suggest its status in the network is different from and higher than theirs. The possibility that this unit type represents something like a command or coordination function within the ARC's zone hierarchy is raised in the lore with appropriate caution. It is one possible reading of the behavioral data, but the consistency of the command behavior observation across multiple independent accounts from different zones and different time periods makes it a compelling one. If there is something like a command structure in ARC zone operation, something that coordinates the overall activities of a zone rather than just executing a specific function within it, then this unit type is the best candidate for what that looks like in practice. The encounters with this high-level unit type that are documented in the lore are uniformly described as extreme experiences, not just because of the unit's combat capability, though that is prodigious, but because of the quality of the experience itself. Witnesses describe a sense of being assessed in a way that is different from the assessment of other ARC units. Other units assess threats. This unit appears to assess the person, the raider, in some way that is different, and that witnesses consistently struggle to articulate clearly. Whether this reflects a genuine difference in the unit's cognitive or sensing architecture, or is a projective response by humans to an entity that feels qualitatively different, is not answerable from the outside. The combat capability of the high-level unit type is, in the accounts that include combat, described as overwhelming relative to anything else in the ARC standard zone deployment. Not just more durable and more powerful, but smarter in engagement. The unit adapts its tactics during an engagement in ways that other ARC units do not. It does not repeat approaches that are failing. It does not stay in positions that are being exploited. It moves, finds angles, and uses the environment in ways that suggest a tactical intelligence operating at a higher level than the pattern execution of other unit types. Raider teams that have survived engagements with this unit type have done so through exceptional individual skill, significant luck, or both. The relationship between the high-level unit type and the inner zone installations it is typically found near is not fully characterized in the lore, but the consistent association between this unit's presence and the most sensitive ARC installations suggests that it plays a role in protecting the most important elements of the extraction operation. It is the final layer of defense before whatever it is the Ark cannot afford to have disrupted. The implications of this for raiders who are trying to reach the inner zone are significant. The last thing between them and the answers is also the most dangerous thing they will encounter. The question of whether there is only one of these units per zone, or multiple, or whether the same unit ranges across zones is not established. The accounts are not detailed enough or cross-referenced enough to determine whether the high-level units observed in different zones are distinct individuals or a single entity observed in multiple locations. The possibility that Ark network coordination extends to a single dominant unit ranging across zones, acting as a mobile command presence, is one reading of the available data. The possibility that each zone has its own hierarchically superior unit is another. Both are consistent with the evidence, and the distinction matters a great deal for understanding how the Ark is organized. The large class units collectively define the character of the Ark's inner zones, and understanding them changes how you understand the zones as a whole. The outer zones are heavily covered by patrol and surveillance, and they are dangerous, but they are navigable, at least for skilled and careful raiders. The inner zones are different. They are not just more dangerous, they are actively hostile in a way that is qualitatively distinct. The density of large class unit presence, combined with the tighter integration of detection and response systems in the inner zone, creates an environment where the margins that experience and skill provide in the outer zones become insufficient. Surviving in the inner zone requires something beyond skill and experience. The lore is honest about this. The few raiders who have reached the inner zones and returned have accounts that are among the most valuable in the game's lore. Not because they contain definitive answers to the questions the lore raises, they generally do not, but because they contain direct observation of Ark operations at their most intensive level. What these accounts describe is a scale of activity and organization that makes the outer zone operations look like a preliminary security perimeter around the real operation. The inner zone is where the Ark is actually doing the thing it came here to do, and the large class units exist to make sure that nothing interrupts that work. The economic logic of the large class unit deployment, the concentration of the most powerful and most expensive units in the areas of greatest operational importance, reflects a consistent organizational intelligence in Ark zone design. Every layer of the zone structure serves a purpose. Nothing is deployed redundantly or wastefully. The crawlers sense, the patrol class enforces, the sentinels guard the threshold, the large class units protect the most important assets and coordinate the most complex operations. Each layer is calibrated to its function, and the calibration is precise enough to suggest that whoever or whatever designed this system understood both the operational requirements and the cost of meeting them. The large class units are the summit of what the Ark deploys in its zones. Above them, in the hierarchy of things that the lore describes, are the installations themselves. Not units at all in the sense we have been using, but systems of such scale and complexity that they occupy a different analytical category entirely. Understanding the installations is the subject of the next chapter, and it is where the extraction economy model, the accumulated observations about unit behavior and zone structure, comes together into something approaching an answer to the central question. Not a complete answer, but closer than anywhere we have been yet. Chapter 8. The installations, what the Ark is building. The Ark installations that occupy the inner zones are the least documented and the most significant elements of Ark presence on Earth. Everything else about the Ark, its unit types, its patrol patterns, its communication network, exists in relation to these installations. They are the reason the zones exist. They are the destination of everything the harvesters collect. They are what the sentinels and large class units protect. Understanding what they are, even partially, is the closest thing to understanding the Ark's purpose. that the available evidence allows. The documentation of Ark installations comes primarily from three sources. Aerial observation, most of it conducted in the early period before Ark air defense capability was fully established, gives a macro-scale picture of installation footprints and layouts. Radar accounts from the few teams that have reached installation perimeters give a ground-level description of outer structures and observed activity, and recovered materials that originate from installation sites, found in intermediate states as harvesters transport them or as debris in adjacent areas, give a materials perspective on what the installations are processing and producing. The aerial observation record, fragmentary as it is, describes installations that vary significantly in size between zones but share certain structural characteristics. There are large, centralized structures that appear to be the core of the installation complex. Around these central structures are organized clusters of smaller structures and open processing areas. The overall footprint of a typical installation is substantial, comparable to a medium-scale industrial facility in human terms. The structures are not identical to human industrial facilities in design. They are clearly built according to different organizational principles, but the scale and apparent functional diversity are comparable. The ground-level descriptions from radar accounts that have reached installation perimeters describe a qualitatively different environment from the outer zones. The density of Ark infrastructure is higher. The level of continuous activity is higher, with multiple unit types and harvester operations visible simultaneously, rather than the sequential encounters typical of outer zone navigation. The noise level is apparently higher as well, industrial in a way that outer zones are not, with sounds that suggest heavy machinery in continuous operation. The overall impression from the accounts is of a facility that is working, that is processing and producing at a significant and sustained rate. What is being produced is the question the law approaches most carefully and hedges most thoroughly. The direct evidence is limited. Raiders who have seen installation activity have seen machines moving, structures being built or modified, materials being transported in and out of specific structures. They have not been able to observe the output of the installation directly, to see what emerges from the processing that goes on inside the central structures, because getting close enough to observe that output has not been possible in the accounts available. The materials evidence is somewhat more informative. Items recovered from the areas around installations by harvesters in transit or found as debris include processed forms of the raw materials that harvesters collect in the outer zones. Materials that were in raw or extracted form in outer zone collection sites appear in more processed states closer to installations. This is consistent with a manufacturing or processing function, raw materials coming in and being transformed into something else. The question is what that something else is. The most detailed physical description of Ark installation structures available in the law comes from a radar account that is treated as among the most significant pieces of law in the game. A radar team penetrated deep enough into an installation zone to briefly observe one of the central structures at close range before they had to withdraw. The description they brought back is detailed and has been analysed extensively by researchers. The central structure was large, significantly larger than it had appeared from aerial observation. Its external surface was covered with components whose function could not be determined by visual inspection. There was a rhythmic vibration to the structure, felt rather than heard, that the radar described as being like standing next to a machine that is working very hard. The structure appeared to be anchored deep into the ground, extending downward as well as upward in ways that aerial observation could not have shown. The downward extension of installation structures is one of the details that has generated the most discussion in the research community. Surface structures are visible and to some degree observable. Subterranean structures are not. If the most significant part of Ark installation infrastructure is underground, the observable portion that radars and aerial observation have characterized represents only the surface of a much deeper system. The law raises this possibility explicitly and notes that it has significant implications for understanding the scale and nature of Ark operations. A facility that extends kilometers underground is a different order of investment from what surface observation alone would suggest. What would be underground in an Ark installation? The extraction economy model suggests that if the Ark is here to collect and process materials for transport elsewhere, some of the processing infrastructure might be designed for operations that benefit from depth, whether for thermal reasons, for access to specific geological features, or for the kind of high-pressure processes that some manufacturing operations require. There is also the possibility, raised in the law but not developed beyond speculation, that the Ark installations are not just processing facilities but transmission facilities, that part of what they're doing underground is related to the mechanism by which processed material is transported off-planet. The off-planet transport question is one that the law leaves almost entirely open. There is no direct observation of Ark material leaving the planet. The aerial observation record shows no visible launch activity from installation zones. There are no recovered components that obviously belong to a launch or transmission system. But the absence of direct evidence for off-planet transport does not establish that it is not happening. If the transport mechanism operates on principles that human detection systems cannot characterize, which is consistent with other aspects of Ark technology, it might be completely invisible to observation. The extraction economy model requires some form of off-planet transport for its internal logic to hold, and the absence of evidence for that transport is not evidence that the model is wrong. The relationship between the large Ark installations and the original drop cylinders that brought the Ark to Earth is something the law hints at without fully developing. The cylinder impact sites are not identical to installation locations, but they are not entirely separate either. The relationship between where the cylinders landed and where the major installations eventually developed is suggestive of a planned deployment, where initial landing sites were selected with subsequent installation siting in mind. Whether this is true, whether the Ark's original landing was planned in relation to what the installations eventually became, is not established. But the geographic relationship is interesting enough to note. The construction timeline of Ark installations is another area where the law provides useful context. The installations did not exist in their current form on the first day of the Ark's arrival. They developed over time, built up progressively from the initial cylinder landing sites. The early records from Ark zones describe much simpler structures that gradually became more complex as construction activity continued. This construction timeline is consistent with the extraction economy model, the Ark building, the infrastructure it needs to execute its collection and processing mission over time, starting from portable initial deployment capability and developing permanent infrastructure as the mission matured. The current state of Ark installations, based on the most recent observations, suggests that construction has continued and that the installations are still being expanded in some zones. Whether this represents ongoing mission growth or maintenance and replacement of existing infrastructure is not clear. The continued construction activity suggests that the mission is not complete, that the Ark has not finished doing what it came here to do. This is simultaneously the most concerning and the most useful piece of information about Ark intent available in the law. Concerning because it means the Ark is not preparing to leave, useful because it means there is still time, from a human perspective, to understand and potentially interrupt what the Ark is doing. The research community's work on installation structure analysis, conducted at considerable personal risk by the individuals who gather the raw data, is one of the ongoing scientific projects described in the game's lore with the most significance attached to it. The goal is not just academic. Understanding what the installations are and what they produce is the foundation for any strategy that goes beyond survival and into the realm of meaningful opposition. You cannot fight what you do not understand. The installations are the heart of the Ark's operation, and the Ark's operation is the thing that has to be understood before any larger response to it can be planned. The emotional weight of the installation question for the human characters in the lore is significant. The installations represent the Ark's purpose, made physical and permanent. They are the evidence that the Ark is not going away, that it is not a disaster that will eventually end and be cleared up, but an ongoing presence with an ongoing function that shows no signs of completing. Looking at an Ark installation, even from a safe distance, is apparently confronting with something that is simultaneously comprehensible. It is clearly an industrial operation of some kind, and completely alien in its purpose and context. The familiarity of the industrial form makes the alienness of the purpose more rather than less disturbing. The installations are what raiders risk their lives to get close to. Not primarily to fight, because you cannot fight an installation, but to understand. Every fragment of information brought back from installation proximity is a piece of an answer to the question that defines the stakes of the entire arc of this game. What is the Ark doing here? The installations are the answer, or rather, they contain the answer, and getting close enough to extract it is the most dangerous and important thing a raider can do. The most recent intelligence on installation activity from the most recent accounts in the lore suggests developments that have not yet been fully analysed or integrated into the existing research picture. New structural elements have been observed that do not match the established installation profile. Activity patterns appear to have shifted in ways that suggest a change in operational phase, rather than simple continuation of existing activities. Something about what the installations are doing appears to be changing, and what that change means for the zones and for the humans in the areas adjacent to them is not yet determined. The story of the installations is not over, it is in progress, and the progress appears to be accelerating. Chapter 9. Anomalies, the cases that do not fit. The standard model of Ark unit behaviour, the classification system built up through years of observation and research, works well for most of what raiders encounter in the zones. Crawlers map. Patrol units enforce. Sentinels guard. Harvesters collect. Large class units protect and coordinate. Installations process. The model is internally consistent and supported by extensive observation. But the lore also contains a category of observations that the model does not account for, encounters and incidents that are inconsistent with established Ark behavioural patterns in ways that are difficult to explain within the existing framework. These anomalies are the subject of this chapter. The first and most commonly reported category of anomalous Ark behaviour is what Raider accounts describe as unit hesitation in situations where engagement would be expected and normal. An Ark patrol unit that detects a raider and then, rather than transitioning to engagement, remains in assessment mode for an extended period before withdrawing without engaging. The assessment phase should last seconds. Extended assessment followed by withdrawal without engagement is not a documented behaviour in the standard model. When it has been reported consistently enough to be taken seriously by researchers, it has not been explained by any variation in the raider's approach or equipment that would differ from standard engagement triggering conditions. The extended assessment anomaly is interesting because it suggests either a fault in the unit's decision-making architecture, producing an error case that should not occur in a well-functioning system, or a decision-making capacity that goes beyond simple, threshold-based engagement, allowing the unit to reach a non-standard conclusion under specific conditions. Neither explanation is entirely satisfying. Fault-based explanations require the Ark to have more system errors than its general operational performance would suggest it should have. Decision capacity explanations require ARC units to have more behavioral flexibility than the standard model allows for. Both require revising the standard model in some direction, and the choice between revisions has significant implications. The second anomalous category concerns the behavior of ARC units around certain human objects and locations that should be operationally neutral but appear to generate specific and consistent ARC responses. Several radar accounts describe finding human objects, typically pre-ARC artifacts, with no apparent tactical significance, that had been moved from their original locations to positions near ARC collection sites, not collected by harvesters, not processed, just moved and positioned. The objects selected for this treatment do not share an obvious common property. They are not all made of the same material or from the same period. The reason they were moved, if there is a reason, is entirely opaque. The object movement anomaly is one of the most discussed in the research community because it resists easy explanation. Harvesters moving objects they intend to collect would be consistent with the extraction economy model, but these objects appear not to have been collected subsequently. Patrol units repositioning objects for tactical reasons would make sense for tactical obstacles, but not for random artifacts. The most provocative reading, and one the law is careful to label as speculative, is that some ARC units are collecting or engaging with objects for reasons that are not explained by operational function, reasons that might reflect something like curiosity or aesthetic response. This reading is considered possible, but not established. The third anomalous category, and arguably the most significant, is the group of accounts describing ARC units behaving in ways that suggest awareness of their own operational history in a zone. Units observed behaving differently in areas where previous ARC unit casualties had occurred, where radar teams had previously conducted operations, or where the ARC had previously experienced network disruptions. The behavior difference is subtle and not easily characterized, but experienced raiders who have operated in the same areas repeatedly describe a quality to the zone that changes after significant events, a sense that the ARC has incorporated the event into its operational model and adjusted in ways that reflect that incorporation. If ARC units adapt their behavior based on zone history in any meaningful way, the implications for radar tactics are significant. Standard radar doctrine has always treated ARC patrol patterns as stable over medium time scales, changing only in response to physical environmental changes. If ARC patterns also adapt in response to human operational history in a zone, then past successful radar approaches may progressively lose effectiveness in areas that have seen repeated use. The doctrine implication would be a need for greater operational unpredictability and less reliance on routes and approaches that have worked before. The fourth anomalous category concerns interactions between ARC units and the natural environment that go beyond functional necessity. Several accounts describe harvesters engaging with biological material, plants, and in some cases small animals, in ways that do not fit the extraction economy model. The interactions are not aggressive. They are more like inspection. A harvester pausing at a living plant, moving a manipulator arm around it without damaging it, and then moving on. Crawlers clustering briefly around small animals that are not human and then dispersing. These interactions are rare in the sense that the conditions for them are rare, but they have been reported often enough across different zones to suggest they are real rather than individual misinterpretations. The biological inspection behavior, if that is what it is, suggests either that biological systems have some relevance to the ARC's operational model that is not captured by the extraction economy framework, or that ARC units are programmed with broader environmental assessment capability than the extraction economy function requires. Either way, it complicates the simple picture of the ARC as a resource extraction machine that is indifferent to biology except insofar as it gets in the way. The ARC appears, in these accounts, to notice living things in a way that is not accounted for by the model. The fifth anomalous category is perhaps the most disturbing in its implications. Instances of ARC units appearing to observe and respond to human behavior in ways that are not threat-related. Multiple accounts describe ARC units, primarily of the larger and apparently more capable classes, observing human radar activity at distance without engaging and without the behavior being explained by the assessment window before engagement. The units watch for extended periods and then move on, not the extended assessment before non-engagement described in the first anomaly category. Something more sustained and less explicable as a system behavior, something that, in the language of one radar account, felt like being studied. The feeling of being studied is reported consistently enough across multiple independent accounts to be taken seriously as a real phenomenon, even if what it represents is genuinely uncertain. The accounts agree that the experience is distinct from the standard ARC assessment behavior and that it has a quality that is difficult to describe without using language that attributes cognitive intent to the unit involved. The careful research community position is that human observers are prone to anthropomorphizing machine behavior, and that the feeling of being studied does not constitute evidence of genuine study. The field accounts are honest about this limitation, while also being honest about the consistency and intensity of the reported experience. The sixth anomalous category concerns the behavior of ARC units when exposed to certain kinds of sound, specifically certain frequencies of human music and speech. This sounds like the kind of observation that should be immediately dismissed as wishful thinking, and the law anticipates this skepticism and addresses it directly. The accounts are specific, and in some cases documented with audio recordings that survived recovery. ARC units exposed to certain acoustic inputs behave differently than they do in the absence of those inputs. The difference is not dramatic. It is not that ARC units stop and listen to music and become momentarily peaceful. The difference is subtle, a slight change in movement timing, a different pattern of head or sensor orientation, a brief pause that is slightly longer than the standard assessment pause. Subtle but consistent, and consistent enough across multiple independent accounts to be reported as real. What this means is genuinely unknown. The ARC sensor systems include acoustic sensing capability. ARC units respond to sounds, including human-generated sounds, as part of their operational function. The anomalous responses to specific acoustic inputs might be nothing more than interesting edge cases in a complex sensor processing system, specific inputs producing unexpected processing states in the sensor architecture. Or they might point towards something about the ARC's underlying design that is not captured by the functional model. The law does not try to resolve this, and I think the honest answer is that we do not yet have the data to resolve it. The anomalies taken together do not overturn the standard model of ARC behavior. The model remains the best framework for understanding what radars encounter in the zones on a day-to-day basis. But the anomalies suggest that the model is incomplete, that there are aspects of ARC behavior and ARC design that are not accounted for by the extraction economy framework and the unit classification system. What those additional aspects are and what they mean for understanding the ARC as a whole is one of the genuinely open questions the law leaves for the future. The research community's relationship to the anomalies is one of careful engagement. The instinct to dismiss them as misinterpretations or exceptional cases is balanced by the awareness that exceptional cases in complex systems often contain the most important information about how the system actually works. The anomalies are taken seriously not because they are numerous or dramatic, but because the standard model is known to be incomplete, and the anomalies are the places where that incompleteness is most visible. Radars who have experienced multiple anomalous ARC behaviors tend to develop a different attitude toward the machines than those who have only experienced standard behaviors. The anomalies create a relationship with the ARC that is different from the purely adversarial. Not friendly, nothing that complicated, but something more like the relationship you have with a natural environment that has surprised you enough times that you have stopped being certain you understand it. The Ark, for those raiders, is not just a threat or an obstacle, it is a presence, and a presence that has more dimensions than the standard model predicts. The anomalies are the places where the law is most honest about its own limitations. The researchers know they do not have a complete picture. The raiders know the zone has surprises left. The standard model is useful, but not complete, and the incompleteness is not a failure of research effort. It is a reflection of the genuine complexity of the thing being studied, a complexity that becomes more apparent, not less, as observation accumulates. Chapter 10. What the Ark might be, theories, questions, and the future. We have covered the specific details of Ark unit types and zone structure across the previous chapters. Now it is worth stepping back from the details and addressing the larger question that all of them are in service of. What is the Ark, and what does it want? Not in the sense of a final authoritative answer, because the law does not provide one, and I am not going to pretend that it does. But in the sense of a synthesis of the available evidence, a summary of the most compelling theories, and an honest account of what remains genuinely unknown. The extraction economy model, which I have referenced throughout these chapters, is the most cohesive single explanation for Ark behavior that the available evidence supports. Under this model, the Ark is an automated or semi-automated resource extraction and processing system deployed on Earth by some originating entity for the purpose of collecting specific materials, processing them, and transporting them to the originating location. Every observable aspect of Ark behavior is consistent with this model. The survey behavior of initial units, the establishment of territorial control, the selective collection by harvesters, the processing installations, the protective security hierarchy, all of it fits. The extraction economy model has the virtue of requiring no mysterious or supernatural elements beyond advanced technology. It posits that the Ark is doing something comprehensible in principle, collecting and processing resources, and that the incomprehensibility of the Ark from a human perspective is a function of the scale and efficiency of the operation, rather than any fundamental mystery about its nature. The Ark is a machine doing a job. The job is big and sophisticated and operating on a scale that humans cannot yet match, but it is, at its core, a job. This makes the Ark legible in a way that more exotic explanations do not. The limitations of the extraction economy model are also real. It does not explain the anomalies catalogued in the previous chapter. It does not account for the behavioral flexibility